International.
Whoops,
What?
a little
Let's
late,
see.
sorry.
Okay, in the 1920s, the United States entered into some international pacts as long as those agreements did not commit America to become politically connected to other countries. And so we entered into a naval disarmament pact, for example. Then in the 1930s, the United States returned to a more traditional form of isolationism. It was during the Great Depression, and so the nation turned inward to deal with domestic economic problems. And throughout the 1930s, America remained apart from Europe and Asia, where fascist countries were rising to power and were becoming increasingly aggressive. Then from 1941 until 1945, the United States once again abandoned isolationism and allied with Britain and the Soviet Union to defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II. So World War II produced a redistribution of world power. By the end of the war, Britain was exhausted and nearly bankrupt. France had suffered an even greater loss of status and power during World War II. And only the United States and Soviet Union emerged from the war capable of exerting influence beyond their borders. In fact, of all the world's nations, only the United States emerged stronger and richer than before World War II. The productive capacity of the United States doubled from 1941 to 1945. And so economically, America was without question the world's dominant power in 1945. The United States replaced Britain as the center of world finance. And America also emerged as the world's predominant military power as well. The United States was the only nation that possessed atomic weapons in 1945. But when World War II ended, there was considerable pressure in the United States to return to a policy of isolationism, just as we did after World War I. Public opinion in America demanded the immediate demobilization of American troops. That process of demobilization began with the defeat of Germany in May 1945, and it continued through 1946. The number of personnel in the US military between the middle of 1945 and the middle of 1947 was reduced almost 90%. So we look at these charts. The number of military personnel in 1945, we had more than 12 million Americans in uniform overseas at the end of World War II. But by June of 1947, that 12 million was just 1.5 million. So that is reflective of a very rapid demobilization. But even with that, American soldiers protested that the process was too slow. Now, President Truman thought that rapid demobilization jeopardized America's strategic position in the world, but he felt helpless in the face of mounting pressure to bring the troops home. And so the troops were brought home. After 1945, a sizable faction of the Republican Party, led by Ohio Senator Robert Taft, called for a return to isolationism. They argued that future engagement in world politics would only increase the possibility of America getting involved in future wars. They also argued that a policy of internationalism would require increased defense spending, and that might be ruinous to the post-war American economy. Now, although the United States stood at the pinnacle of economic and military power after World War II, there was a mood of uncertainty that swept the nation. Because of the advances in technology, the United States was no longer protected by two oceans. Advances in transportation drastically shrunk distances. It made the world seem more compact and more menacing. And the atomic bomb was an enormously destabilizing influence in the post-war years. Now, Truman and his advisors knew that they had to face international difficulties presented by the post-war peace. And to make things more complicated, Republicans won control of both houses in the 1946 midterm elections. And there was considerable isolationist sentiment among Republicans. And the Republican victory in 1946 was a considerable setback for Truman, who was an unelected and an unpopular president in 1946. Truman needed help from the new Republican majority. And while he wouldn't get that help from isolationists like Senator Taft, he turned to another Republican senator, Arthur Vandenberg, who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Vandenberg was a senator from Michigan. He had been a hardline isolationist before World War II. He thought America's participation in World War I was a mistake. And during the 1930s, he supported neutrality legislation that was intended to keep the United States out of war. But during World War II, he evolved and he abandoned his commitment to an isolationist foreign policy. In early 1945, on the floor of the Senate, he spoke in favor of American membership in the United Nations organization. Now, Truman hoped that Vandenberg, even though he was a Republican, could be a useful ally to forge bipartisan support for a more internationalist foreign policy. Some in the American foreign policy establishment had become alarmed over Soviet behavior in the period immediately following World War II. In February of 1946, George F. Kennan, a Soviet expert in the State Department, he sent an 8,000-word telegram to his superiors in Washington, warning about Stalin's expansionist agenda. It became known as the Long Telegram. And as you can see, it was a stinging letter criticizing the Soviet Union. And his letter urged that the United States should adopt a policy to prevent the further spread of communism around the world. A month later, in 1946, Winston Churchill made a speech in Fulton, Missouri, warning that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. And of course, he was referring to the countries that you see in this map in brown. Those were the countries of Eastern Europe that the Soviet Union dominated and installed communist governments. In March of 1947, President Truman requested that Congress appropriate $400 million to aid the Greek and Turkish governments, which were fighting communist insurgents at that time. Truman pledged to support peoples who were resisting attempted subjugation by outside pressures. That pledge became known as the Truman Doctrine, and it marked the adoption of containment as official US policy. So the Truman Doctrine, I think we're hearing some noise in the background. Jerry, could you be sure that all microphones are silenced? So the Truman Doctrine promised that the United States would support free peoples who are resisting communism. And This doctrine met resistance from a skeptical public and from members of Congress who were opposed to American involvement abroad. Isolationists objected to getting the US entangled once again in European conflicts. And Americans on the political left opposed supporting repressive right-wing regimes in Greece and Turkey in the years following the Truman Doctrine. Yet the Truman Doctrine successfully convinced many Americans that the United States was locked in a life or death struggle with the Soviet Union. And so the Truman Doctrine set the guidelines for more than 40 years of US-Soviet relations. Vandenberg, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, was instrumental in getting bipartisan approval for the Truman Doctrine. Then in July 1947, under the pseudonym Mr. X, George Kennan published an article entitled "The Sources of Soviet Conduct," in which he called for a policy of containment towards the Soviet Union. That article created a sensation, and the term containment instantly entered Cold War lexicon. Now, Europe as a whole had been devastated by World War II. And amid the destruction and poverty, communist parties were making huge gains in Italy and in France. And so in 1948, Congress enacted the European Recovery Program, providing more than $15 billion for the economic restoration of Europe. That program was also known as the Marshall Plan, named after the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall. It was yet another plank in Truman's project to contain the spread of communism. And the Marshall Plan was so successful that by 1952, just 4 years later, Europe had fully recovered and Marshall aid was then suspended. Now, after World War II, Germany and the city of Berlin had been divided into 4 zones of occupation. There was the British zone, the French zone, the American zone, and the Soviet zone. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 zones. Now, the citizens of West Berlin were dependent on supplies coming by rail and road from West Germany. And in 1948, Stalin imposed a blockade of all links between West Germany and West Berlin. And so the Western nations responded by airlifting 2.3 million tons of cargo to provide the citizens of West Berlin with food, fuel, and clothing. And this Berlin airlift lasted almost a year. The crisis ended when the Soviet forces lifted the blockade on access to Western Berlin. Then in 1949, the United States joined with 11 other nations in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a mutual defense pact intended to repel any Soviet attack. The US commitment to NATO was the first peacetime military alliance in American history. And most significantly, it represented the strongest repudiation yet to Washington's advice that the United States should steer clear of foreign entanglements. Now, the United States was deeply entangled with 11 other nations. Isolationists like Senator Robert Taft argued that arming the nations of Western Europe would only promote war. But in the end, the Senate overwhelmingly ratified the NATO treaty. In response to the Soviet explosion of an atomic device in 1949 and China's fall to communism also in 1949, the State Department drafted NSC 68, National Security Council Document 68. It was a report that recommended that the United States embark on a rapid military expansion of conventional forces, as well as an expansion of its nuclear arsenal, including the development of the new hydrogen bomb. In addition, NSC 68 called for massive increases in military aid to allies of the United States. This document proved to be one of the most important American foreign policy statements. It provided the blueprint for the militarization of the Cold War from 1950 up to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Not only did it make the case for resisting Soviet expansionism, it reinforced the idea of America's redemptive mission by declaring that the United States must take on the responsibility of world leadership to promote principles of freedom and democracy. And so, taken as a whole, these 5 policy decisions, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, NATO, and NSC 68, they represented a diplomatic revolution in American foreign policy. It meant that unlike after World War I, when the United States retreated back into isolation, after World War II, America was firmly committed to an internationalist foreign policy, where even the United Nations was situated in this country. And that transition from isolationism to internationalism was achieved with bipartisan support in Congress, thanks largely to the efforts of Senator Vandenberg. In addition, the United States took the lead in supporting the establishment of the United Nations. Now, whereas in 1919, the Senate rejected America's participation in the League of Nations, in 1945, the Senate approved America's participation in the United Nations by a vote of 89-2. So that is reflective of the change in attitude towards America's participation in the world after 1945. Under Truman, the United States entered into additional global commitments. His Point 4 program extended American technical, economic, and military aid to countries throughout the world, and mostly to developing countries in Asia and Africa and the Middle East and Latin America. And when North Korea invaded South Korea in June of 1950, the United States took the lead in sending troops to repel the aggression of North Korea. But despite all this, isolationist sentiment in the United States did not fade away entirely. The 1952 Republican presidential primary was a contest between moderates, such as Dwight Eisenhower, who felt that the United States needed to fight the Cold War overseas and to resist the aggression of the Soviet Union, and on the other hand, conservatives like Robert Taft, who were non-interventionists, who believed that America should avoid alliances with foreign powers. Eisenhower rejected the notion of a fortress America isolated from the rest of the world, safe behind its nuclear shield. He believed that active American engagement in world affairs was the best way to resist the encroachment of Soviet-sponsored communism. His victory in the 1952 Republican primary and then in the presidential election guaranteed that America in the second half of the 20th century would follow an internationalist foreign policy. Although Eisenhower was critical of the way Truman was handling the war in Korea, he concurred with the essential thrust of Truman's foreign policy. He agreed on the need for the US to be actively engaged in world affairs. He agreed with Truman on the need to repel communism. And he agreed that the United States should enter alliances with other countries to defend against Soviet expansion. Under Eisenhower, the United States engaged in what was called PACT-O-MANIA. That was a strategy designed to encircle the Soviet Union and Communist China with American allies. And so the United States entered defensive pacts such as the Southeast Treaty Organization, the Australia-New Zealand-US Treaty, as well as bilateral treaties with Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Spain, and the Philippines. So you can see on this map, the United States was allied with all those countries on the map in dark blue. And these countries surrounded the Soviet Union and China. And because of all of these pacts, Eisenhower's policy was called PACT-O-MANIA. By the end of Eisenhower's 8 years as president, the United States was bound to 8 separate security treaties and was committed to defend no fewer than 42 nations around the world. And the Eisenhower administration adopted strategies to prevent communist influence from growing in third world countries. Thus, under the Eisenhower administration, the United States offered foreign aid to developing countries, and the US sent military advisors there. Also, America supported right-wing counter-revolutionary organizations because they were anti-communist. And if those strategies didn't work, the administration resorted to covert activities. So under Eisenhower, the CIA expanded its role beyond just gathering intelligence. Now the CIA was overthrowing foreign governments in Iran and Guatemala because they were suspected of leftist leanings. The CIA planned unsuccessful coups in Indonesia and Cuba. From the end of World War II to the 1990s, American foreign policy was characterized as one of liberal internationalism. So what do we mean by liberal internationalism? Well, liberal internationalism is based on 3 broad objectives: to prevent the spread of communism, to promote an open trading system that would guarantee the growth and prosperity in the United States and in capitalist democracies around the world. And the third objective of liberal internationalism was to preserve and extend democracy around the world. And in aiming to spread liberal values, liberal internationalism was consistent with America's messianic mission to serve as a city on a hill, that is, a model for other countries to emulate. And these 3 objectives served as guideposts for the US grand strategy from the 1940s into the 21st century. Between 1948 and 1991, US forces engaged in 46 military interventions and made more than 70 attempts to overthrow governments of other countries. But sometimes the objective to stop the spread of communism would conflict with the third objective, to preserve and extend democracy throughout the world. And so, sometimes to prevent communism, the United States supported right-wing dictatorships because they were anti-communist, but that would contradict the objective of extending democracy. Over the course of the 1950s and the 1960s, isolationism gravitated to the fringes of American politics. But the isolationist impulse would return in response to the Vietnam War. In the 1972 presidential election, the Democratic candidate, George McGovern, called for withdrawing all US troops from Vietnam and from South Korea. He demanded the reduction of the military presence in Europe by 50%. The theme of his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention was "Come Home, America," which is an expression of isolationism. And as the Vietnam War dragged on, an increasing number of Americans protested US involvement in the conflict. In a survey that posed the question, should the United States mind its own business internationally? In 1964, only 18% of the respondents agreed. But by 1974, 41% agreed that the United States should mind its own business internationally. But the public really didn't want a return to isolationism. What it wanted was a retrenchment. Despite McGovern's "Come Home, America" theme, Nixon carried 49 of the 50 states in the 1972 presidential election. And so the fear of an isolationist comeback in the 1970s really was a false alarm. Now, Congress did pass the War Powers Act in 1973 that required Congress's consent before a president could send American troops into action. But beyond that, America was still very active in the international community. But President Nixon recognized the need to pull back, the need for retrenchment. And so, starting in 1972, that is exactly what he did. He pursued a policy of Vietnamization that gave South Vietnamese forces the primary responsibility for combat. He also decided to rely on allies such as Iran and Saudi Arabia to provide security in the Persian Gulf so that the United States would not have to do so. And Nixon pursued détente with the Soviet Union so that we would not have to be so active in preventing the spread of communism. And in 1972, he visited China to improve relations with that country. Following Nixon, Presidents Ford and Carter continued to rely heavily on diplomacy in order to diffuse Cold War tensions. But this policy of retrenchment, of pulling back, ended with the Reagan presidency. In the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Reagan labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire, and he boosted defense spending. He engaged in a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union and provided assistance to anti-communist movements in Nicaragua and other areas as well. But in his second term, he joined with Mikhail Gorbachev in using diplomacy to pave the way for a dramatic de-escalation of tensions with the Soviet Union. And that ultimately set the stage for the end of the Cold War. So, from the end of World War II to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was bipartisan support for liberal internationalism. And that left prominent isolationists like Senator Robert Taft and Representative Ron Paul in the political wilderness. And in the 1990s, it seemed as if liberal internationalism had triumphed. Former Soviet bloc countries joined NATO, as well as joining the European Union. In the 1990s, China turned to capitalism, and numerous developing countries transitioned from authoritarian rule to democracy. Apartheid in South Africa came to an end in the 1990s. And so by the dawn of the 21st century, the United States could legitimately claim that it had fashioned a democratic world order. But within the US, bipartisan support for liberal internationalism began to unravel in 1994, when in the midterm elections of that year, Republicans took both houses of Congress. Because the Soviet threat had been eliminated by 1994, Democrats and Republicans no longer felt they needed to work together on foreign policy issues. And as a result, both parties reverted to positions that they took in the years just prior to World War II. Democrats favored policies that emphasized multilateralism, working with other countries, and policies that emphasized diplomacy rather than the use of force, while Republicans supported the use of force rather than diplomacy and wanted the United States to act alone rather than multilaterally. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the American public became less enthusiastic for foreign engagement. In a 1991 poll, a wide majority of respondents favored withdrawing American troops from Western Europe and from South Korea. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1991, the Senate voted by a very slim margin to authorize the use of force against Iraq. Print and broadcast media in the 1990s cut back coverage of foreign affairs. And by the end of that decade, only 3% of Americans said that foreign policy was a primary concern. Nevertheless, President Clinton wanted to extend liberal internationalism as well as multilateralism. And so, under Clinton, the United States accepted former communist countries into NATO. And Clinton encouraged the expansion of the G7 nations to the G20 nations, making it a much broader venue for international communications. Clinton pushed for China's admission into the World Trade Organization, and he supported the NAFTA trade agreement. And so these are all examples of how President Clinton supported multilateralism. But when it came to the use of force, the Clinton administration backed off, withdrawing US troops from Somalia in 1993, refusing to intervene in the Rwanda genocide in 1994, and staying out of the civil war in the former Yugoslavia. And the United States did stay out until Clinton approved of the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999. Now, Republicans opposed Clinton's brand of globalism. And so Republicans voted against US participation in the International Criminal Court. Republicans opposed the Kyoto Environmental Protocol, and the Senate rejected a comprehensive test ban treaty in 1999. Now, since the end of the Cold War, two contradictory trends in US foreign policy has emerged. On the one hand, the United States has been overreaching, trying to do too much. On the other hand, realizing this, the United States has tried to reduce foreign commitments. And so, between 1992 and 2017, the United States had carried out 188 military interventions. And that represents a fourfold increase when compared with the Cold War era. So this is what we mean by overreach, 188 military interventions. And the United States has been fighting unwinnable wars in the Middle East for 2 decades. The 2002 intervention in Afghanistan was a war of necessity. It was to prevent future 9/11 attacks. But the 2003 invasion of Iraq was a war of choice and a strategic blunder. If the Clinton presidency was an era of multilateral diplomacy, the Bush presidency was the era of unilateralism and force. The neocons in the Bush II presidency sought to fulfill America's messianic mission by turning Afghanistan and Iraq into Western-style democracies. But instead of regime change, America's endless wars in the Middle East has produced only instability and bloodshed, rather than producing democratic regimes crafted after America's image. So by the time Bush left office in 2009, America's image overseas had been seriously damaged. Even our closest allies, Germany and Britain, had a negative view of the United States. And the bipartisanship that prevailed during the Cold War almost vanished completely under the Bush presidency. In the 2004 presidential election, Bush insinuated that a Democratic victory would mean, quote, the terrorists win and America loses. That is a reflection of the end of bipartisanship. Now, after Bush, President Obama was committed to an internationalist agenda. He famously claimed that America remains the one indispensable nation, and the world needs a strong America. On another occasion, he declared, America must always lead on the world stage. If we don't, no one else will. And so Obama supported multilateralism from NATO to the UN. The United States participated in the World Bank, and Obama proposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The United States entered the Paris Climate Accord and the Iranian nuclear deal under the Obama presidency. But even as Obama embraced American exceptionalism, he recognized the danger of overreach. And so he sought to scale back the nation's strategic footprint abroad. He asked US allies to shoulder more of the cost for peacekeeping operations. In 2011, he ended the US military presence in Iraq. And as part of his strategic retrenchment, he chose not to use force against Syria when Assad crossed the red line by using chemical weapons against his own people. Obama demonstrated similar restraint when Russia annexed the Crimea in 2014. Obama preferred economic sanctions rather than the use of force. And when he did resort to force, such as against Libya in 2011, the United States did so as part of an overall NATO operation with limited objectives and using surgical airstrikes rather than ground troops. But unfortunately, developments in the Middle East foiled Obama's best efforts of retrenchment. In 2014, he had to send US troops back into Iraq to help the government there fight the Islamic State. And American forces were sent to help local fighters defeat the Islamic State in Syria as well. Now, we're going to take a look at a return to the isolationist impulse. At his inaugural address in January 2017, Donald Trump announced, from this day forward, it's going to be only America first. Thus, he made clear that he intended a clean break with the era of liberal internationalism. Trump insisted that globalization had worked to the disadvantage of too many Americans, that because of globalization, too many jobs were going overseas. Trump's election reflected public anger over the nation's overreach, over economic dislocation at home, and over a broken immigration system. Trump announced that the United States would no longer promote democracy and nation building abroad, that he would protect American jobs by imposing tariffs on foreign goods, and that he would tighten immigration policies. So by emphasizing nationalism rather than globalism, Trump seemed to suggest a return to the isolationist foreign policy that the US pursued for much of its history up until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Trump reflected an attitude towards entangling alliances that would have resonated with Washington and other founding fathers. And so Trump branded NATO obsolete. He announced a reduction of the American military presence in Germany, and he contemplated withdrawing the US Defense Pact with Japan. Trump pulled US troops out of Syria, and he announced a complete US military withdrawal from Afghanistan by 2021. Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord, the Iranian nuclear deal, and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. He reduced America's contributions to the UN. He withdrew the United States from the UN Human Rights Council and from the United Nations Economic and Social Council, UNESCO. And with the COVID pandemic raging in spring of 2002, Trump pulled the US from the World Health Organization. His aversion to multilateralism prompted him to support Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. Trump also broke with America's mission of spreading democracy throughout the world by exhibiting a fondness for autocracy. He seemed to prefer strongmen like Vladimir Putin, like Hungary's Viktor Orban and Kim Jong-un, and Egypt's Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, while denigrating Democratic allies such as Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau. On trade, Trump returned to the earlier policy of protectionism by withdrawing the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and by slapping tariffs on imports from America's main trading partners. So this return to protectionism is reflected in this cartoon, with the world being very upset with Trump's protectionist policies. Now, the Biden administration has reversed some of Trump's isolationist agenda by re-entering the Paris Climate Accord, by reclaiming membership in the World Health Organization, and with plans to resume the Iran nuclear deal. Also, Biden has criticized Putin and Russia's misbehavior, and Biden has tried to repair and rebuild relations with our Democratic allies. Nevertheless, a sizable portion of the electorate believes that the US should stop acting as the world's policeman, that the United States should pull back from foreign commitments, and that the United States should focus more attention at home, addressing problems of infrastructure, protecting jobs, and controlling immigration. But Americans are not calling for a full retreat from the world. Survey polls indicate that a majority of Americans endorse the participation in fighting climate change and in promoting human rights. And by and large, a majority of Americans support international trade and preserving alliances such as NATO. But it does seem that the electorate is demanding some kind of an adjustment, a middle course between the nation's original isolationism and its more recent overreach. So it seems that American foreign policy today is at a crucial turning point, just as it was after World War I and World War II. The consensus behind liberal internationalism has collapsed. Illiberal forces have reversed the spread of democracy around the world, and Americans have turned inward. The COVID pandemic has led to the tightening of America's borders, and the global balance of power seems to be shifting away from the United States towards China. And recent American military ventures have not gone very well. But it's too late for the United States to return to a policy of isolationism. The United States cannot shield itself from the outside world, even if we wanted to. Today, nations are too connected. They're too interdependent, economically, socially, and technologically. Too many of today's global challenges require broad international cooperation. And so nations must work together to resolve global threats of climate change, of nuclear proliferation, of global pandemics, and the vulnerability of cyberspace. While a policy of isolationism did enhance American security and prosperity in the 19th century, it misled the United States in the years between World War I and World War II, when fascist aggression threatened to destroy democracy. An internationalist foreign policy seemed to serve America's interests throughout the Cold War. But since then, it has led to endless wars in the Middle East and an overextension of American resources worldwide. So moving forward, the challenge is to find a middle path between isolationism and overreach. That is, we must find a judicious retrenchment of America's international responsibilities. And I would suggest that would mean that we should pull out of the wars in the Middle East, that we should scale back the presence of American troops on bases throughout the world. But I would also argue that it would be a mistake for the United States to withdraw from Europe and Asia, because that would only unsettle our allies and it would embolden our adversaries. The fact is, the world still needs the United States as a beacon of democratic values and institutions. Those nations that share America's commitment to individual freedom and the rule of law, they lack the economic and political might to promote those principles on a global scale. Therefore, I would suggest the world needs America as an anchor against the rise of illiberalism and autocracy that we have witnessed in places like the Philippines and Poland and Hungary. But it will be difficult for the United States to advance the cause of liberty without putting its own house in order. And so the United States must address institutionalized racism, economic inequality, and a broken immigration system. If America is to reclaim its mission to spread democracy, it should do so by example, by advocacy, and not by conquest or intervention as it had in the past. But the United States cannot try to recast the world in its own image. That's what President Woodrow Wilson and the second George Bush tried to do. We must refrain from nation building. We must recognize that not all countries want to emulate the American example, that not all countries are prepared to do so. And so the United States must engage in a messy and imperfect world, and it must work with both democratic and undemocratic regimes. Thus, I suggest that American foreign policy should be guided by a judicious retrenchment from liberal internationalism rather than a return to isolationism if we are to prevail in this ever-changing world. And that concludes the fourth and final lecture.